I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Margaret Winters standing on my front lawn at 7 in the morning, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She had that look on her face, the one that every homeowner in Riverside Meadows subdivision in Fort Worth, Texas, had learned to fear over the past 3 years since she became HOA president. Her perfectly highlighted blonde hair was pulled back so tight it probably gave her a headache, and her HOA-mandated beige pantsuit looked freshly pressed despite the early hour. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out before I could even get my coffee down, "we need to talk about your garage." I paused halfway down my driveway, my work bag slung over my shoulder. It was a Tuesday, and I had a meeting with a client in 45 minutes. I did not have time for whatever nonsense Margaret had cooked up this week. "What about my garage?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She marched toward me, her sensible heels clicking against the concrete. "The HOA board reviewed our records last night, and we have no documentation of approval for this structure. You built it without proper authorization." I stared at her. My garage, the detached two-car garage that had been standing on my property for 8 months, the garage I had spent $12,000 building after jumping through every bureaucratic hoop the city and the HOA had thrown at me. "Margaret, you approved it yourself. I have the paperwork." "Show me," she demanded, holding out her hand. "It's inside. I'm on my way to work." "Then you'll need to provide it to the board within 72 hours, or we'll begin fines. $200 per day until the structure is removed or proper documentation is provided." My jaw clenched. $200 per day. That was $1,400 a week, $6,000 a month, for a garage that had been properly approved. "I'll get you the paperwork," I said through gritted teeth. "See that you do." Margaret spun on her heel and walked back toward her house 3 doors down, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. I sat in my truck for a full minute, trying to calm down before I drove. Margaret had been a thorn in everyone's side since she took over the HOA. She had fined the Johnsons $2,000 for painting their front door navy blue instead of the approved midnight blue. She had forced the Chens to rip out their vegetable garden because it violated some obscure landscaping code. She had even tried to make my neighbor, Tom Fletcher, remove his American flag because it was supposedly 2 inches too large for HOA regulations. But this was different. This was not about some petty violation or interpretation of vague rules. I had approval. I had gone through the proper channels. I had done everything right. That evening, I went straight to my home office and pulled out the filing cabinet where I kept all my important documents. I had a whole folder dedicated to the garage project. Contractor estimates, city permits, inspection reports, and right there in the middle, the HOA Architectural Review Approval Form. I pulled it out and stared at it. The form was dated March 15th of last year. It had been stamped with the official HOA seal, and at the bottom, in neat blue ink, was a signature approving the project. The signature read, "Margaret Winters, HOA President." I actually laughed out loud. She had signed it herself. Either she had completely forgotten, which seemed impossible given her obsessive record-keeping, or she was playing some kind of game. Knowing Margaret, it was probably the latter. I scanned the document and emailed it to the HOA board's official email address, then made a physical copy to deliver in person. I was not taking any chances. The next morning, I drove to Margaret's house before work and dropped the copy through her mail slot. I made sure to take a photo of myself doing it with the timestamp visible. If she wanted to play games, I would document everything. I heard nothing for 2 days. No email, no phone call, no acknowledgement that she had received the documentation. On the 3rd day, I found another notice taped to my front door. "Dear Mr. Reynolds, the document you provided is insufficient. The HOA has no record of this approval in our system. Without verification from our records, we cannot accept this as valid authorization. Fines will begin accruing as of tomorrow, June 6th, at the rate of $200 per day. Sincerely, Riverside Meadows HOA Board." I read it 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. Insufficient? Her own signature was on the form. Her own seal was stamped on it. How could that possibly be insufficient? I called the HOA hotline and got the automated message telling me to leave a voicemail. I did, keeping my tone professional but firm. No one called back. I sent another email, attaching the approval form again and requesting an explanation. No response. On Thursday evening, I drove to Margaret's house and rang the doorbell. I could see her car in the driveway and lights were on inside, but no one answered. I rang again, waited, then knocked. Still nothing. "I know you're in there, Margaret," I called through the door. "We need to talk about this." A curtain twitched in the front window, but the door stayed closed. Friday morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice stapled to a wooden stake in my front yard. Violation, unapproved structure, daily fines in effect. That was it. I was done playing nice. I took the day off work and drove to the Fort Worth City Planning Department. If the HOA would not verify their own approval, then I would get verification from the city. My garage had required city permits too, and those permits would show that everything had been done legally. The planning department was housed in a bland government building downtown with fluorescent lights and beige walls that made Margaret's pantsuit look adventurous. I waited in line for 20 minutes before reaching a clerk named Dana, according to her name tag. "I need to pull building permits for my property," I explained, sliding my ID and property information across the counter. Donna typed into her computer, squinting at the screen. "Address is 847 Meadowbrook Lane." "That's right." "Let me see what we have." She clicked through several screens, then pulled up what looked like a permit database. "Okay, I'm showing your original house construction from 1998, then a permit for a deck addition in 2015, and a detached garage structure from last year. That the one you need?" "Yes, exactly." "Give me a minute to pull the full file." She disappeared into a back room and returned 5 minutes later with a manila folder. "Here we are. Permit was issued April 2nd, construction began April 15th, final inspection passed July 21st. Everything looks in order." "Can I get copies of everything in that file?" "Sure thing. It will be 50 cents per page." "That's fine." Dana took the file to a copy machine and started running pages. While I waited, I glanced at the documents she had already copied. Property survey, engineering plans, contractor licenses, inspection reports. And then I saw something that made me stop cold. It was the HOA approval form, the same one I had in my files. But this copy had additional city stamps on it, showing that it had been submitted as part of the permit application. The city had verified the HOA approval before issuing the building permit. "Dana," I said slowly, "does the city verify HOA approvals before issuing permits?" She looked up from the copier. "For subdivisions with active HOA covenants, yes. We require proof of HOA architectural approval before we'll issue a permit for any external structure. Otherwise, we'd have people building things that violate their HOA rules, then trying to use city permits as a shield. It is a whole mess." "So this HOA approval form was verified by the city?" "Had to be, or you would not have gotten your permit. Let me check who processed it." She flipped through the original file and found a processing sheet. "Looks like it was verified by phone with the HOA president directly. There's a note here from our permit tech, Jake Morrison. Says he called and spoke with Margaret Winters on March 18th, and she confirmed the approval was valid. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Can I get a copy of that processing sheet too?" "Sure." Dana finished making copies and handed me a thick stack of papers. I paid her $12 in cash and walked out of the building in a daze. Margaret had not just approved my garage. She had confirmed that approval to the city. She had personally verified it to a city employee. There was a paper trail showing she knew exactly what she had authorized, and now she was claiming it had never happened. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and called my brother-in-law, Kevin, who was a real estate attorney in Dallas. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus, what's up?" "I need legal advice. My HOA is trying to fine me for an unapproved garage that their president personally approved and verified with the city." "Slow down. Start from the beginning." I explained the whole situation, from Margaret's visit to the city records. Kevin listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. "You still have your original approval form?" he asked when I finished. "Yes, with her signature." "And the city has records showing she verified it?" "I have copies right here." "Marcus, this is either complete incompetence or deliberate fraud. Either she's lost her mind and genuinely doesn't remember approving it, or she's trying to shake you down." "Why would she shake me down?" "I don't know. Have you had any conflicts with her? Any reason she'd want to harass you specifically?" I thought about it. I had voted against Margaret in the last HOA election, but so had a lot of people. She had won by only 15 votes out of 130 homes. I had also spoken up at a board meeting 3 months ago when she tried to raise HOA dues by 30%, but that motion had failed anyway. Nothing major, I said. Just normal HOA politics. Well, something's going on. Here's what you need to do. Document everything, every interaction, every email, every notice. Get your communications in writing whenever possible. And send a certified letter to the HOA board, not just Margaret, laying out all the facts. Include copies of your approval form and the city verification. Demand they cancel the fines and formally acknowledge your garage is approved. What if they refuse? Then you get an attorney who specializes in HOA disputes. And trust me, if this is deliberate harassment, you could have grounds for a lawsuit. HOAs have significant power, but they can't just make up violations that don't exist. This is insane. I built a garage, a normal 2-car garage. Welcome to HOA hell, buddy. Let me know if you need a referral for an attorney. I thanked him and hung up, then sat there staring at the stack of paperwork Dana had given me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought was forming. Something about this whole situation did not add up. Why would Margaret deny approving something when there was clear documentation? She was meticulous about records. She sent monthly newsletters detailing every HOA decision. She kept copies of everything. There was no way she had simply forgotten. I drove home and spent the rest of the afternoon drafting a letter to the HOA board. I included every fact, every date, every piece of documentation. I attached copies of the approval form, the city verification, and the permit records. I was polite but firm, demanding the board acknowledge the garage was properly approved and cancel all fines. I printed 5 copies, 1 for each board member, and put them in envelopes with certified mail tracking. I would drop them at the post office first thing Monday morning. But I could not shake the feeling that something else was going on. Margaret was many things, petty, vindictive, power-hungry, but she was not stupid. She had to know this would blow up in her face eventually. So why push it? That weekend, I decided to do some investigating. I started by pulling up the HOA's bylaws and covenant documents online. Riverside Meadows had a fairly standard set of rules: architectural review requirements, landscaping guidelines, parking restrictions, the usual suburban nonsense. But as I read through the architectural review section, something caught my attention. The bylaws stated that any modification to property requiring city permits also required HOA approval through the Architectural Review Committee. The committee was supposed to consist of 3 board members, and approvals required a majority vote. I pulled out my approval form again and looked at it more carefully. Only Margaret's signature was on it. There was no indication that a committee had reviewed it, no record of a vote, just her signature and the HOA seal. I checked the HOA website for the list of current board members. Margaret was president. The vice president was a man named Donald Pritchard. The treasurer was a woman named Linda Morrison. The secretary was a man named Robert Kane. And there was one at-large member named Jennifer Walsh. I did not know any of them well. Donald lived on the other side of the subdivision and kept to himself. Linda was married to Jake Morrison, the city permit tech, which was an interesting coincidence. Robert had only moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago, and Jennifer was relatively new to the board, having been elected in the same election that brought Margaret to power. I decided to reach out to them directly. If Margaret was acting unilaterally, maybe the other board members did not even know what was going on. I found Donald Pritchard's house on Sunday afternoon and knocked on his door. He answered wearing a golf shirt and khakis, looking confused to see me. "Hi, I'm Marcus Reynolds. I live over on Meadowbrook Lane." "Oh, sure. I think we met at a meeting last year. Donald Pritchard." "Right. Listen, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm having an issue with the HOA, and I wanted to get your perspective." His expression immediately became guarded. "What kind of issue?" "The board is trying to fine me for my garage, claiming it was never approved. But I have documentation showing Margaret approved it last year, and the city verified that approval." "I was wondering if you knew anything about it." Donald shifted uncomfortably. "I don't really handle the day-to-day stuff. Margaret manages most of the architectural reviews." "But doesn't the committee vote on approvals? The bylaws say it requires a majority." "Well, yeah, technically. But Margaret usually handles the straightforward ones and just updates us at the monthly meetings. If there's a problem, you should take it up with her. I've tried. She won't respond to my calls or emails. I don't know what to tell you, man. If Margaret says there's an issue, there's probably an issue. She's pretty thorough. I could see I was not going to get anywhere with Donald. He was either clueless or deliberately avoiding conflict with Margaret. Okay, thanks anyway. I tried calling Linda Morrison next, but she did not answer. I left a voicemail explaining the situation and asking her to call me back. She never did. By Monday morning, I was frustrated and exhausted. I dropped my certified letters at the post office and went to work, trying to focus on my actual job instead of HOA drama. The letters were delivered on Wednesday, according to the tracking information. I waited for a response, and waited, and waited. By the following Monday, I had heard nothing from anyone on the board, but I did find another notice on my door, informing me that my fines now totaled $1,400 and were continuing to accrue. I called Kevin again. They're ignoring me. Did you get confirmation the letters were delivered? Yes, signed for by Margaret herself. Okay, that's good. Gives you a timeline. Now, it is time to escalate. I'm going to refer you to a colleague of mine, Patricia Lopez. She handles HOA disputes and she's aggressive. You'll like her. This is going to cost me a fortune, isn't it? Probably. But if you let them steamroll you, it will cost more. These fines add up fast, and if they put a lien on your house, you're really in trouble. I made an appointment with Patricia Lopez for Thursday afternoon. Her office was in a modern building in downtown Fort Worth, all glass and steel. She was a short woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to assess me immediately. Kevin told me about your situation, she said, gesturing for me to sit. You brought the documentation. I handed over the folder I'd compiled. Approval forms, city records, the processing sheet showing Margaret's phone verification, copies of all my communications with the HOA, photos of the violation notices. Patricia spent 20 minutes reviewing everything, making notes on a legal pad. Finally, she looked up. This is either the stupidest thing I've ever seen an HOA do or something else is going on. That's what I keep thinking. Tell me about Margaret Winters. How long has she been HOA president? 3 years. Any history of similar disputes? She's fined plenty of people, but usually for legitimate violations. Overgrown lawns, wrong paint colors, stuff like that. This is the first time I've heard of her denying a documented approval. Patricia tapped her pen against her notepad. I want to do some digging before we send a formal legal demand. Something about this doesn't smell right. Do you mind if I do a property records search? For what? For your property, the HOA's corporate records, Margaret's property, anything that might explain what's going on. These searches are public record, but they take time to compile. Go ahead, whatever you need. It will take a few days. In the meantime, do not pay those fines. Do not acknowledge them as valid. Keep documenting every interaction. I left her office feeling slightly better. At least someone was taking this seriously. 3 days later, Patricia called me. Marcus, can you come to my office? I found something interesting. I drove straight there. Patricia had papers spread across her conference table, property records and building permits and HOA documents. I pulled the city's records for all building permits in Riverside Meadows for the past 5 years, she said without preamble. Your garage permit was processed by Jake Morrison, the permit tech. According to the notes, he called Margaret Winters to verify your HOA approval on March 18th. Right? I saw that. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I pulled every other permit processed by Jake Morrison in your subdivision. There are 14 of them. Deck additions, garage conversions, fence installations, that kind of thing. And guess what? Every single one has a note showing Jake called to verify HOA approval with Margaret Winters. So I called the city planning department and asked to speak with Jake. Turns out he retired 6 months ago, but I tracked him down and gave him a call. Nice guy, very chatty. He remembers your subdivision because Margaret Winters made his job difficult. How? Patricia smiled grimly. According to Jake, Margaret called him personally after she became HOA president and insisted that all permits for Riverside Meadows go through her for verification. She said it was to prevent homeowners from bypassing the HOA process. Jake thought it was overkill, but he didn't care. It made his job easier to have one point of contact. Okay, but that still doesn't explain why she's denying my approval. I'm getting there. Jake kept detailed logs of all his calls with Margaret, and according to his records, Margaret personally verified 14 HOA approvals over the past 3 years. Yours was one of them. He specifically remembers it because you were doing a detached garage, which required additional engineering review. So she definitely knew about it. Oh, she more than knew about it. Here is the kicker. I pulled the property records for those other 13 permits that Margaret verified. And guess what I found? I shook my head. 8 of them are rental properties, and 6 of those 8 are owned by Meadowbrook Investments, LLC, a property management company registered in Texas. I don't understand what that has to do with my garage. Patricia pulled out another document. I ran a corporate registry search on Meadowbrook Investments, LLC. It was formed 3 years ago, and the registered owner is Margaret Winters. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What? Margaret owns a property investment company that owns rental homes in her own HOA, and she personally verified city permits for those properties, but now she's claiming your approval doesn't exist. But why? What does she gain from fining me? Patricia leaned back in her chair. That is what we need to figure out. But I have a theory. Do you know what happens if HOA fines go unpaid? The HOA can put a lien on the property, right? Exactly. And if the lien goes unpaid long enough, the HOA can foreclose. They can literally take your house and sell it to recover the fines. My mouth went dry. You think she's trying to force me into foreclosure? I think it is a possibility we need to consider. If she could force you out and buy your property through her investment company at a foreclosure auction, she'd get it well below market value. That is insane. That is fraud. That is why we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If Margaret is deliberately creating fake violations to force foreclosures, that's not just an HOA dispute. That is criminal fraud, possibly racketeering. I sat down heavily. I built a garage. I know, and now we're going to make sure Margaret Winters regrets ever messing with you. But first, I need to do more research. I want to know if anyone else in the subdivision has faced sudden violations for previously approved work, and I want to know if any properties have gone into foreclosure in the past 3 years. How long will that take? Give me a week. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. If Margaret contacts you, get it in writing. Record any phone conversations if Texas law allows it. Texas is a one-party consent state. Perfect. Then record everything. And Marcus, watch your back. If Margaret is running a scheme, she's not going to be happy when we expose it. I left Patricia's office feeling like I had stumbled into a crime thriller. This was not supposed to happen in suburban Fort Worth. People were supposed to mow their lawns, barbecue on weekends, and complain about traffic. They were not supposed to run real estate fraud schemes through HOAs. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. HOAs had enormous power over homeowners. They could fine you, restrict your property use, and even foreclose if you did not pay. And if the HOA president was corrupt, there was very little oversight. I started doing my own research. I went to the county recorder's office and pulled foreclosure records for Riverside Meadows. In the past 3 years, there had been 4 foreclosures in the subdivision. 3 were standard bank foreclosures from mortgage defaults. But one was an HOA foreclosure. The property was 1243 Oak Ridge Court. The owner had been a man named Stephen Ortega. According to the records, he had been fined by the HOA for multiple violations. The fines had gone unpaid. The HOA had placed a lien and eventually foreclosed. The property had been sold at auction 18 months ago. I cross-referenced the buyer, Meadowbrook Investments, LLC. Margaret's company had bought the foreclosed property for $65,000. The property was currently listed as a rental for $1,800 a month. I checked Zillow to see what comparable homes were selling for in the neighborhood. Similar properties were going for $220,000. Margaret had bought a house worth $200,000 for $65,000, all because of HOA fines. I needed to know more about Stephen Ortega. I tracked down a phone number through a people search website and called him. A man answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Hi, is this Stephen Ortega? Yeah, who's this? My name is Marcus Reynolds. I live in Riverside Meadows, and I'm having a problem with the HOA. I saw that you used to live there, and I was hoping to ask you some questions. There was a long pause. You're having problems with Margaret Winters? Yes. Get out. Sell your house and get out. That woman destroyed my life. What happened? Stephen's story poured out. He had lived in Riverside Meadows for 5 years. Shortly after Margaret became HOA president, she started hitting him with violations. His grass was too long, even though he mowed every week. His house color was non-compliant, even though it had been the same color for 5 years. His satellite dish violated HOA rules, even though it had been installed before the rules changed. The fines piled up. Stephen tried to fight them, but the HOA board backed Margaret on every decision. He hired an attorney, but legal fees ate through his savings. Eventually, he stopped paying the fines because he could not afford them. The HOA placed a lien. Stephen tried to refinance to pay it off, but the lien made it impossible. The HOA foreclosed. I lost everything, Stephen said, his voice bitter. My home, my equity, everything. And you want to know the worst part? After they foreclosed, all those violations magically disappeared. Margaret's company bought my house and rented it out, and suddenly the grass length was fine. The color was fine. Everything was fine. Did you ever take legal action? I couldn't afford it. I was tapped out from the first attorney. And by the time I realized what had happened, I'd already lost the house. What was I supposed to do? I'm working with an attorney now. I think Margaret is running a fraud scheme. If we can prove it, would you be willing to testify? Testify against Margaret Winters? Yes. Another long pause. Then, yeah, I'll testify. If you can take that woman down, I'll do whatever you need. I got Stephen's contact information and promised to have Patricia reach out. Then I called Patricia and told her everything I had found. Marcus, this is bigger than I thought, she said. We're not just talking about your garage anymore. This is systematic fraud. We need to bring this to the authorities. What authorities? The county district attorney's office, for starters. If Margaret is using her HOA position to fraudulently foreclose on properties and buy them through her company, that's criminal fraud, theft by deception, possibly mail fraud if she used the postal service for violation notices. This could be a felony case. You really think the DA would care about HOA disputes? If we can show a pattern of fraud resulting in theft of property, absolutely. This isn't petty HOA politics. This is serious white-collar crime. But we need more evidence. One foreclosure isn't enough. We need to show a pattern. How do we do that? We need to find other homeowners who've been targeted, people who've faced sudden violations for previously approved work, people who've been hit with excessive fines. Can you reach out to your neighbors? I spent the next week knocking on doors and making phone calls. Most people did not want to talk about the HOA. They were either terrified of Margaret or apathetic. But a few people opened up. Tom Fletcher, my neighbor, told me about the flag incident. He had flown an American flag in his front yard for 10 years. Margaret had suddenly declared it non-compliant and threatened fines. Tom had taken it down rather than fight. The Johnsons, 3 streets over, told me about their door. They had painted it what they thought was midnight blue, matching the approved color chart. Margaret had declared it navy blue and fined them $2,000. They had repainted it to avoid further penalties. The Chens had been forced to remove their vegetable garden, even though decorative gardens were allowed. Margaret had declared vegetables agricultural use and therefore prohibited in a residential zone. But the person who gave me the most useful information was a woman named Sandra Carlson. She lived 2 blocks away and had been fighting with Margaret for over a year. Sandra had built a sunroom addition on the back of her house. She had gotten HOA approval, city permits, everything done properly. But after construction was complete, Margaret declared the sunroom was 6 inches too wide and violated setback requirements. Sandra had been fined $5,000 and ordered to either modify or remove the sunroom. The thing is, Sandra told me, sitting in her kitchen with tears in her eyes, I had it surveyed twice. It's exactly within setback requirements. The surveyor confirmed it. The city inspector confirmed it. But Margaret won't back down. She says the HOA has its own setback rules that are stricter than the city's. But I looked at the bylaws, and they reference the city setbacks. She's making it up. Have you hired an attorney? I can't afford one. I already spent $35,000 on the sunroom. I don't have money for legal fees, so I've been paying the fines in installments, trying to save up enough to either fight it or just tear the thing down. How much have you paid in fines? So far, about $8,000, and they're still accruing. I told Sandra about Patricia and about what we were investigating. Her expression shifted from despair to anger. You think she's trying to force me into foreclosure? I think it's possible. That bitch, that absolute bitch. Would you be willing to talk to my attorney? Yes. Absolutely yes. I connected Sandra with Patricia, then kept digging. I made a spreadsheet of everyone in the subdivision who had received significant fines in the past 3 years. The list grew to 23 people, 23 homeowners who had been hit with major violations and substantial penalties. I cross-referenced them against property records. Of those 23, 5 had sold their homes and moved away. 3 were in active disputes with the HOA, 2 had paid fines totaling over $10,000 each, and 1, Stephen Ortega, had lost his home to foreclosure. Patricia filed a formal demand letter with the HOA board, requiring them to produce records of all architectural review committee meetings for the past 3 years, all violation notices issued, and all financial records related to fines and foreclosures. The letter made it clear that we suspected fraud and were prepared to escalate to law enforcement. The response came 3 days later, not from Margaret, but from an attorney named Brian Schultz, representing the HOA. The letter was professional and coldly dismissive. It stated that the HOA had no obligation to provide records to an individual homeowner beyond what was required by law, that all actions taken were in accordance with HOA bylaws and covenants, and that Mr. Reynolds' garage remained in violation pending proper documentation. They're stonewalling, Patricia said when I showed her the letter, which means we're hitting a nerve. Time to bring in the big guns. She filed a lawsuit in Tarrant County District Court. The complaint alleged fraud, breach of contract, abuse of authority, and sought damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages. She also filed a motion for discovery, demanding all HOA records, and she contacted the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office. The DA's office assigned an assistant district attorney named Raymond Cole to review the case. Patricia and I met with him in a bland conference room at the county building. Raymond was a thin man in his 40s with graying hair and a skeptical expression. Patricia laid out the evidence: the pattern of violations against homeowners, the foreclosure of Stephen Ortega's property, Margaret's ownership of Meadowbrook Investments, the purchase of foreclosed property below market value, my garage approval that Margaret now denied. Raymond listened, taking notes. When Patricia finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. This is interesting, but it's not quite enough for a criminal case. HOA disputes are usually civil matters. People fight with their HOAs all the time. This isn't just a dispute, Patricia countered. This is a deliberate scheme to defraud homeowners out of their property. Maybe, but to prove criminal fraud, I need to show intentional deception with the purpose of financial gain. Right now, I've got an HOA president who's aggressive about enforcement, one foreclosure that may or may not be legitimate, and some questionable property purchases. That's enough for your civil suit, but it's not enough for me to bring criminal charges. What would be enough? I asked. Raymond looked at me. I need proof of intentionality. Emails, phone calls, documents showing that Margaret Winters knowingly created false violations for the purpose of forcing foreclosures. Or, I need multiple foreclosures with the same pattern. 1 is an anomaly. 3 or 4 is a pattern. Can you find me either of those things? Patricia and I exchanged glances. We'll keep digging, she said. After the meeting, I felt deflated. We had so much evidence, but apparently not the right kind. We needed something that proved Margaret's intent. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the approval form, about Margaret's signature, about the city verification. Why would she deny something so clearly documented unless she was deliberately trying to create a violation? And then I remembered something. Donald Pritchard had said Margaret usually handled architectural reviews herself and just updated the board at meetings, which meant there should be meeting minutes documenting those updates. Meeting minutes were supposed to be available to all homeowners. I had never looked at them before because I had never cared about the minutia of HOA business. But now, I wanted to see them. I went to the HOA website and found the meeting minutes section. Most months had standard summaries, budget updates, landscaping contracts, covenant enforcement. But when I got to the minutes from April of last year, shortly after my garage was approved, I found something interesting. The minutes stated, President Winters reported on architectural reviews. 3 applications were reviewed and approved by the committee: Reynolds Garage, Morrison Fence, and Davidson Deck Addition. So Margaret had reported my approval to the full board. It was in the official minutes. She had acknowledged it publicly. I downloaded and printed the minutes, then sent them to Patricia. She called me within an hour. This is good. This shows she knew about the approval and reported it to the board, but we need more. We need to find out what happened to those other properties she mentioned, the Morrison Fence and the Davidson Deck. I looked up the Morrisons and the Davidsons in the subdivision directory. The Morrisons were Linda Morrison, the HOA treasurer, and her husband Jake, the former city permit tech. That was an interesting connection. The Davidsons lived on the north side of the subdivision. I drove to the Davidson house and knocked on the door. A woman in her 60s answered, looking wary. Can I help you? Hi, I'm Marcus Reynolds. I live over on Meadowbrook Lane. I'm having an issue with the HOA, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your deck. Her expression hardened. What about my deck? I saw in the meeting minutes that it was approved around the same time as my garage. I was wondering if you've had any problems with the HOA, claiming it wasn't approved. Mrs. Davidson's husband appeared behind her. Who is it, Helen? Someone asking about our deck. Mr. Davidson, a tall man with white hair, stepped forward. The HOA approved our deck, and then 6 months later they tried to say it violated setback requirements. We had to hire an attorney and fight it for 8 months before they finally backed down. Cost us $12,000 in legal fees. Did Margaret Winters claim there was no approval? No. She admitted we had approval. But she said the builder hadn't followed the approved plans, and the deck was 3 feet longer than approved. It was complete nonsense. We had the original plans, and the surveyor confirmed the deck matched them exactly. But Margaret wouldn't drop it until our attorney threatened to sue for harassment. Did you ever figure out why she targeted you? Mr. Davidson shrugged. We think it's because we voted against her in the HOA election. She's been vindictive toward anyone who opposed her. I thanked them and left, my mind racing. Margaret had gone after the Davidsons too, using a similar tactic. Approve the project, then later claim there was a problem and levy fines. I went home and started searching through public records online. I wanted to find every property in Riverside Meadows that had been sold in the past 3 years and see if any others had gone to Meadowbrook Investments. It took hours of searching through county records, but I finally found what I was looking for. In addition to Stephen Ortega's property, 2 other homes in the subdivision had been purchased by Meadowbrook Investments in the past 3 years. Both had been listed as distressed sales below market value. I pulled the full property records. One had been an estate sale after the owner died with no heirs. That was probably legitimate. But the other had been sold by a couple named Richard and Pamela Foster for $90,000, well below the market value of similar homes. I found a phone number for Richard Foster and called. A man answered, sounding tired. Hello? Hi, is this Richard Foster? Yeah. My name is Marcus Reynolds. I live in Riverside Meadows, and I'm investigating some issues with the HOA. I saw that you sold your house there a couple years ago, and I was hoping to ask you some questions. Look, man, I don't want to talk about that place. It was a nightmare, and we're done with it. I understand, but I think the HOA president might be running a fraud scheme. If you could just tell me what happened, it might help me stop her from doing it to other people. There was a long silence. Then Richard sighed. Fine, but I'm only telling you this once. Richard and Pamela had lived in Riverside Meadows for 7 years. After Margaret became HOA president, they started getting violation notices. Their mailbox was the wrong color. Their tree was too tall. Their driveway had cracks that needed repair. The fines started small, but escalated quickly. We tried to fix everything she complained about, Richard said. But as soon as we fixed one thing, she found something else. It was like she was determined to fine us no matter what we did. Eventually, the fines added up to over $20,000. We couldn't afford to pay them and afford an attorney to fight them, so we decided to sell and get out. How did Meadowbrook Investments end up buying your house? We listed it for sale, but Margaret kept scheduling HOA inspections and making potential buyers aware of all the violations. Nobody wanted to buy a house with $20,000 in HOA fines attached. Meadowbrook Investments made us an offer way below what the house was worth, but they agreed to take over the fines as part of the purchase. We were so desperate to get out that we took it. Did you know Margaret Winters owned Meadowbrook Investments? What? No, are you serious? Yes, she owns the company that bought your house. Richard started cursing, a long, creative stream of profanity. That lying, cheating criminal. She forced us out of our home and bought it herself? It looks that way. Would you be willing to talk to my attorney and possibly testify? Hell yes. Give me the number. I connected Richard with Patricia, then compiled everything I had found. 3 properties purchased by Margaret's company, all at below market prices. 1 through HOA foreclosure, 2 through distressed sales after the owners were hit with excessive fines. Stephen Ortega's story, Richard Foster's story, Sandra Carlson's ongoing harassment, the Davidsons' legal battle, my own garage dispute. The pattern was clear. Margaret was using her position as HOA president to target homeowners, create violations real or fabricated, levy excessive fines, and then either foreclose on the properties or force the owners to sell at below market prices to her company. Patricia compiled all the evidence into a comprehensive report and sent it back to the district attorney's office. This time, Raymond Cole was interested. "This is substantial," he said when we met again. 3 properties, multiple victims, clear financial motive. I think we have enough to open a criminal investigation. What happens next? I asked. We investigate. We'll interview the victims, subpoena HOA records, look at Margaret Winters' financial records, trace the money flow through Meadowbrook Investments. If the evidence supports criminal charges, we'll present it to a grand jury. How long will that take? Months, probably. White-collar crime investigations aren't fast, but in the meantime, your civil lawsuit will proceed. That might actually help pressure her into making mistakes. Patricia's lawsuit moved forward. The judge granted our motion for discovery, ordering the HOA to produce all records related to architectural reviews, violation notices, and financial transactions for the past 5 years. Brian Schultz, the HOA's attorney, tried to fight it, but the judge was unsympathetic. "This is a homeowners association, not the CIA," the judge said during a hearing I attended. "If you have nothing to hide, produce the records. If you do have something to hide, you're going to produce them anyway." Motion granted. The records arrived 6 weeks later, dozens of boxes of documents. Patricia and I spent days going through them, and what we found was damning. The Architectural Review Committee had not met in over 2 years. Every approval or denial in that time had been made unilaterally by Margaret, with no committee vote. That was a direct violation of the HOA bylaws. There were violation notices for 47 different properties in the past 3 years. 47 homes had been fined, some multiple times. The total fines levied exceeded $300,000. But here was the interesting part. 32 of those 47 properties had eventually paid the fines or corrected the violations. 15 had not. Of those 15, 3 had been foreclosed or sold to Meadowbrook Investments. The other 12 were in various stages of dispute or payment plans. Patricia highlighted every property that was currently in active violation status with unpaid fines over $10,000. There were 7 of them, including mine and Sandra Carlson's. "These are her targets," Patricia said. "She's going after these 7 properties next. We need to warn them." We contacted all 7 homeowners. Most were already aware they were in trouble, but they did not know about Margaret's company or the pattern of fraud. When we explained what was happening, their reactions ranged from shock to fury to tears. One of them, a single mother named Rebecca Wallace, broke down crying on the phone. She had been fined $18,000 for a shed that Margaret claimed was too large. Rebecca had built the shed to store her late husband's tools and equipment, things she could not bear to get rid of. She had gotten HOA approval for the shed, but after it was built, Margaret had claimed it exceeded the approved dimensions. "I've been paying $200 a month toward the fines," Rebecca said through tears. But it's not enough. They keep adding more fees and interest. I'm going to lose my house. My kids and I are going to lose our home. We're going to stop her, I promised. Just hold on a little longer. Patricia filed an emergency motion requesting the court to freeze all HOA enforcement actions against the 7 targeted properties pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. The judge granted a temporary restraining order, halting all fines and preventing the HOA from taking any foreclosure actions. That was when Margaret finally made a mistake. She called me directly from her personal cell phone at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. I was in my living room reviewing documents when my phone rang. I did not recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Hello? Mr. Reynolds, this is Margaret Winters. Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear anger underneath. Margaret, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. We need to talk about this lawsuit you've filed. It's causing significant problems for the HOA. Good. Mr. Reynolds, I'm trying to resolve this reasonably. If you withdraw your lawsuit and pay a reduced fine of $5,000, we can make this all go away. I almost laughed. You want me to pay you $5,000 for a garage you approved? The board has reviewed your approval form and determined it was issued in error. However, we're willing to negotiate rather than continue this legal battle. Issued in error. You signed it yourself. You verified it with the city. You reported it to the board in the meeting minutes. There was a pause. I don't know what you think you found, Mr. Reynolds, but you're making a serious mistake. This lawsuit is going to cost you far more than $5,000. Is that a threat? It's a reality. Legal fees add up. You've already spent what? $10,000? $15,000? And for what? You're going to lose anyway. I don't think so. In fact, I think you're going to lose. And when you do, you're going to jail. Her voice went cold. Excuse me? The DA is investigating you, Margaret, for fraud, for using your HOA position to steal people's homes. We know about Meadowbrook Investments. We know about Stephen Ortega and Richard Foster. We know about all of it. Silence. Then, quietly, you can't prove anything. We already have. 3 properties, multiple victims, a clear pattern. You're done. She hung up. I immediately called Patricia and told her about the conversation. She was furious that I had tipped our hand, but also excited. She tried to bribe you, Patricia said. She offered to make it go away for $5,000. That's consciousness of guilt. Did you record the call? No, I didn't think to. Damn. Okay, well, your testimony about the call is still useful. And the fact that she called you at all, after months of refusing to communicate, shows she's panicking. The next morning, I found a formal letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It stated that the board had reviewed my garage approval and determined it was valid. All fines were rescinded and the matter was closed. I immediately forwarded it to Patricia. They're trying to moot the case, she said. They think if they give you what you want, you'll drop the lawsuit and they can make this all go away. What do? We don't drop anything. The lawsuit isn't just about your garage anymore. We've amended the complaint to include fraud claims on behalf of all the victims. Your garage dispute is just one piece of a much bigger case. The district attorney's investigation intensified. Raymond Cole subpoenaed Margaret's personal financial records and Meadowbrook Investments corporate records. He interviewed Stephen Ortega, Richard Foster, Sandra Carlson, the Davidsons, Rebecca Wallace, and a dozen other homeowners. The grand jury convened in October. Patricia and I were not allowed in the grand jury room, but Raymond kept us updated. The grand jury heard testimony for 2 days, reviewed documents and financial records, and then voted. Margaret Winters was indicted on 14 counts, 9 counts of fraud, 3 counts of theft by deception, and 2 counts of abuse of position of trust. The indictment alleged that she had used her position as HOA president to create false or exaggerated violations, levy excessive fines, and then profit by purchasing the properties at below market prices through her company. She was arrested on a Friday afternoon. I was not there, but Sandra Carlson called me immediately. She had been driving past Margaret's house and saw the police cars. "They're arresting her," Sandra said, her voice giddy with disbelief. "There are 3 police cars and they're walking her out in handcuffs." I felt a surge of satisfaction that was probably uncharitable but deeply felt. Margaret Winters, HOA president and neighborhood tyrant, was being arrested for fraud. The local news picked up the story that evening. Fort Worth, HOA president arrested on fraud charges, read the headline. The news segment featured footage of Margaret being led to a police car, her face frozen in shock and fury. They interviewed several homeowners, including Stephen Ortega, who gave a scathing account of how he had lost his home. The story went viral. HOA horror stories were always popular online, and this one had everything. A corrupt president, stolen homes, legal drama, and a perp walk. Within days, it was being covered by national news outlets. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Margaret as president. Donald Pritchard was installed as interim president. He immediately issued a statement saying the board had been unaware of Margaret's actions and was cooperating fully with authorities. I did not believe him. The board had either been complicit or criminally negligent. Either way, they shared responsibility. Patricia filed an amended lawsuit adding Donald Pritchard, Linda Morrison, Robert Kane, and Jennifer Walsh as defendants, alleging they had failed in their fiduciary duty to oversee Margaret's actions. Margaret's criminal trial was scheduled for March of the following year. In the meantime, she was released on $50,000 bail with conditions that she not contact any homeowners in Riverside Meadows and not participate in any HOA activities. The civil lawsuit moved toward trial as well. Brian Schultz, the HOA's attorney, tried to negotiate a settlement, but Patricia was not interested in letting them off easy. We want full restitution for all victims, punitive damages, legal fees, and a court order reforming the HOA's governance structure, Patricia told him during a settlement conference. That's going to bankrupt the HOA, Schultz protested. Then maybe the HOA should not have enabled a criminal, Patricia shot back. Eventually, we reached a settlement. See or no, the HOA agreed to pay $800,000 in damages to be distributed among the victims based on their individual losses. Stephen Ortega got his house back. The HOA purchased it from Meadowbrook Investments at fair market value and transferred title back to him. Richard Foster received a cash settlement of $130,000, representing the difference between what he should have gotten for his house and what he actually received. Sandra Carlson got her fines refunded plus $50,000 in damages. Rebecca Wallace got her fines refunded plus compensation for emotional distress. I received my fines refunded, $50,000 in damages, and full reimbursement of my legal fees, which had ballooned to $28,000. But more importantly, the settlement required the HOA to implement new governance rules. All architectural review decisions had to be made by a full committee vote with recorded minutes. A third-party management company would handle violations and fines, and homeowners would have the right to appeal any decision to an independent arbitration panel. Margaret's criminal trial began in March. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Stephen Ortega, Richard Foster, Sandra Carlson, and other victims. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Raymond Cole walked the jury through every property, every violation, every fine, every purchase by Meadowbrook Investments. He showed the jury Margaret's financial records, proving she had personally profited by over $400,000 from the scheme. The defense tried to argue that Margaret had been enforcing HOA rules in good faith and that any errors were unintentional, but the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was too clear, the financial motive too obvious. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 14 counts. At sentencing, the judge was blunt. Mrs. Winters, you held a position of trust in your community. You were elected to serve your neighbors, to protect their property values and maintain their neighborhood. Instead, you abused that trust in the most egregious way possible. You systematically targeted vulnerable homeowners, created false violations, and stole their homes for your own profit. This was not a mistake. This was not overzealous enforcement. This was a calculated, sustained criminal enterprise. He sentenced her to 12 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution of $400,000 to the victims. Margaret showed no emotion as the sentence was read. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I never saw her again. The remaining HOA board members resigned shortly after the trial. A new board was elected, including Sandra Carlson as president. One of their first acts was to formally apologize to everyone who had been targeted by Margaret and to establish a victim compensation fund using the HOA's reserves. My garage, the structure that had started this whole nightmare, still stands in my backyard. Sometimes I look at it and think about everything that happened because I decided to build a place to park my cars. Stephen Ortega moved back into his house and retired early, saying he had earned the right to never deal with an HOA again. Richard and Pamela Foster used their settlement money to buy a house in an unincorporated area with no HOA. Sandra Carlson became a fierce advocate for HOA reform and testified before the Texas legislature in support of a bill strengthening homeowner protections. As for me, I learned that sometimes the only way to fight corruption is to shine a light on it. Margaret Winters thought she was untouchable, that her position gave her the right to do whatever she wanted. She was wrong. The story made national headlines for months. HOA reform became a hot topic in Texas and several other states. Lawmakers introduced bills requiring HOAs to carry liability insurance, submit to regular audits, and provide clearer appeals processes for homeowners. I got contacted by dozens of people from across the country, all with their own HOA horror stories. Some were as bad as mine, others worse. I connected them with attorneys and helped them organize. A few cases are still ongoing. The Fort Worth City Planning Department updated their procedures after the scandal. They now maintain a public database of all HOA approvals verified during the permit process, so homeowners have backup documentation if their HOA tries to deny a legitimate approval. Jake Morrison, the retired permit tech, gave an interview to the local paper saying he wished he had paid closer attention to the pattern of Margaret's calls. He said he felt guilty for not recognizing what was happening sooner. Linda Morrison, his wife and the former HOA treasurer, was never charged with any crime. The investigation found no evidence she knew about Margaret's scheme, though many people, including me, suspect she must have noticed something. She and Jake moved to Oklahoma shortly after the trial. The property at 847 Meadowbrook Lane, my house, is still my house. My garage is still there, fully approved and documented. And every time I pull into it, I think about the fight it took to keep it. People ask me if I regret building the garage, if it was worth all the stress and legal fees and months of fighting. I tell them yes, absolutely yes. Because it was never really about the garage. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could abuse power without consequences. Margaret Winters is currently incarcerated at the State Women's Prison in Gatesville, Texas. She will be eligible for parole in 2031. I do not think anyone from Riverside Meadows will be writing letters of support. The subdivision is quieter now. The new HOA board is reasonable, focused on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement. The neighborhood pool got renovated. The playgrounds were updated. People actually like living here again. I still have the original approval form from my garage, Margaret's signature clearly visible at the bottom. I keep it framed in my home office, a reminder that documentation matters and that sometimes the proof of corruption is right there in writing, if you know where to look. The city records that showed Margaret verified my approval to Jake Morrison, those became Exhibit A in the criminal trial. The meeting minutes where she reported my approval to the board, those became Exhibit B. Her own words, her own signatures, her own records, all used to prove her guilt. That is what she never understood. She was so meticulous about documenting everything, so proud of her record-keeping, that she created a perfect paper trail of her own crimes. She thought the records proved she was right. Instead, they proved she was lying. I talked to Raymond Cole after the trial, thanking him for taking the case seriously. He told me that white-collar crime investigations often fail because prosecutors think they are too complicated or too boring for juries. But this case proved that people understand fraud when you show them a clear pattern. Nobody needed an accounting degree to understand that Margaret was stealing homes. Patricia Lopez became something of a celebrity in HOA law circles. She gave presentations at legal conferences about how to identify and prosecute HOA fraud. She told me she has taken on 5 more cases similar to mine, HOAs in different parts of Texas where board members were abusing their positions. 2 have already settled, and the other 3 are heading to trial. One of the unexpected consequences of the case was that Riverside Meadows became kind of famous, in a bad way. People would drive by slowly, pointing out Margaret's old house. A true crime podcast did an episode about the case. A local theater company even staged a play loosely based on the story, though they changed all the names and set it in a fictional Dallas suburb. Margaret's house, the one she had lived in while running her scheme, eventually sold to a nice couple from Austin who knew nothing about the case. I heard they got a good deal because of the property's notoriety. I wonder if they know their home was the command center for a real estate fraud operation. Meadowbrook Investments, LLC, was dissolved as part of the restitution process. All remaining properties owned by the company were sold at fair market value, with proceeds going to the Victim Compensation Fund. The company's bank accounts were seized and emptied. Margaret's personal assets, including a vacation condo in South Padre Island I had not even known about, were liquidated. She lost everything. Her home, her money, her freedom, her reputation. And honestly, it was hard to feel bad about it. She had done the same to Stephen Ortega and tried to do it to at least a dozen other people. Justice felt appropriate. I ran into Donald Pritchard at the grocery store about 6 months after the trial. He looked older, tired. He tried to avoid eye contact, but I walked right up to him. "Donald." "Marcus, look, I'm sorry about everything that happened." "Were you really unaware of what Margaret was doing?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I knew she was strict about enforcement. I didn't know she owned the company buying the properties. I swear I didn't know that." "But you knew people were losing their homes. You knew she was levying huge fines, and you did nothing." "What was I supposed to do? She was the president. She ran the meetings. I just went along." "That's exactly the problem, Donald. People like you go along, and people like Margaret get away with destroying lives." He did not have an answer for that. He mumbled something about needing to finish shopping and hurried away. I let him go. He was not worth my anger anymore. The new HOA board, under Sandra's leadership, commissioned an independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years. The audit found multiple irregularities, including payments from HOA funds to vendors who did not exist. It looked like Margaret had been embezzling HOA dues on top of her real estate fraud. The amounts were relatively small, maybe $20,000 over 3 years, but it added another layer to her criminal enterprise. The auditors turned their findings over to the DA's office, but since Margaret was already in prison serving a 12-year sentence, they decided not to file additional charges. It seemed pointless to add embezzlement to her existing convictions. My life eventually returned to normal. I went back to focusing on my job, spending time with friends, doing regular suburban dad stuff, but I stayed involved in HOA reform advocacy. I testified before a Texas House committee considering new legislation, telling my story and urging stronger protections for homeowners. The bill eventually passed. It requires HOAs in Texas to maintain detailed records of all board actions, provide homeowners with clearer appeals processes, and submit to annual financial audits. It is not perfect, but it is a start. I also helped start a website called HOA Truth, where homeowners can share their stories and find resources for fighting back against abusive associations. The site gets thousands of visitors a month, people desperate for help, people looking for attorneys, people just wanting to know they are not alone in fighting their HOA. Some of the stories are heartbreaking. Elderly couples losing homes they have lived in for decades over minor violations, single parents drowning in fines they can't afford, veterans being harassed for flying flags. The abuse of HOA power is more widespread than I ever imagined. But there are also success stories. People who fought back and won. People who exposed corrupt board members. People who organized their neighborhoods and voted out bad leadership. Change is possible, but it requires courage and persistence. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. I had the financial resources to hire Patricia Lopez. I had the documentation to prove my case. I had the time and energy to fight. Many people in similar situations do not have those advantages, and they get steamrolled by their HOAs. That is why the legal reforms matter. That is why the advocacy matters. Every homeowner should have a fair chance to defend themselves against an abusive HOA, regardless of their income or resources. My garage, the innocent structure that sparked this entire saga, has become a symbol of sorts. When journalists write about HOA reform, they often mention the garage in Fort Worth that exposed a criminal conspiracy. It is strange to think that my decision to build a place to park my cars led to criminal indictments and legislative reform. But that is the thing about corruption. It thrives in the dark, in the mundane, in the places where people do not think to look. A garage approval seemed like such a small thing. Just paperwork, just bureaucracy. Who would commit fraud over a garage? Margaret Winters would. And she did. And she got away with it for years because people assumed HOA decisions were legitimate. People assumed the board members were acting in good faith. People assumed that if they just followed the rules, everything would be fine. But following the rules does not protect you when the person enforcing the rules is corrupt. That is the lesson I learned. That is the lesson I try to share with other homeowners. On the 3-year anniversary of Margaret's arrest, several of us gathered at Sandra's house. Stephen Ortega was there. Richard and Pamela Foster drove in from their new place. Rebecca Wallace brought her kids. We had barbecue and beer and spent the afternoon swapping stories about our experiences. It felt good to be with people who understood what we had been through. The stress, the fear, the anger, the relief when justice finally came. We had all survived Margaret Winters, and we had all come out stronger. Stephen raised his beer bottle in a toast. To Marcus and his garage, the garage that took down a criminal. Everyone laughed and drank. It was funny when you put it that way. A garage, such a mundane thing to spark such an extraordinary battle. But that is real life. Justice does not always come from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes from paying attention to paperwork, from documenting everything, from refusing to back down when someone tries to gaslight you about what you know to be true. Margaret swore my garage was never approved. The city records, bearing her own verification, proved she was lying. That simple contradiction was the thread that, when pulled, unraveled her entire criminal enterprise. I still live at 847 Meadowbrook Lane. My garage is still standing, and every time I park my car inside it, I think about Margaret Winters sitting in a prison cell in Gatesville, serving 12 years for thinking she was smarter than everyone else. She was not, and the evidence was there all along, in the documents she signed, in the records she verified, in the trail of lies she left behind. Sometimes justice is just a matter of reading the fine print and having the courage to point out when the emperor has no clothes. The subdivision of Riverside Meadows is doing well these days. Property values have recovered after the initial dip following the scandal. New families are moving in, attracted by the good schools and reasonable HOA. The new board is competent and fair, focused on actual community needs rather than power trips. And my garage, the structure that started it all, remains exactly where it is supposed to be. Properly approved, properly documented, and properly vindicated. That is the end of my story. A story about a garage, an HOA president, and what happens when corruption meets documentation. Margaret Winters thought she could rewrite history, claim things were never approved, steal homes with impunity. She was wrong. The records told the truth. Justice prevailed, and I still have my garage.